Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As many of us have the opportunity to have what is known as that profound change in our lives, we can find ourselves going day to day, doing the things we've always done and finding that sense of, well, sort of a wonderment of what is next. Maybe you find your routine turning yourself and your life into a rut. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book, What Wags the World? It's a combination of tales of consciousness awakening in which people in the book are featured with stories in which they had profound life-altering experiences which definitely changed the course of their lives. On the program, we're joined with its author, who is the founder of New Consciousness Review and is also the host of a weekly podcast known as New Consciousness Radio. She also interviews authors and filmmakers and also the co-founder of the Luminary Voices, a speakers bureau of transformational speakers and musicians. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Miriam Knight. Miriam, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Delighted to be here.
You know, it's always an exciting thing to have a compilation of stories of people who, you know, they kind of go day to day believing that they're following what their life's path is, and all of a sudden there's an awakening. Something profound happens that really changes and alters the course of their path. Tell us how you came to collect these stories and why you decided on these particular people.
Well, I've been interviewing authors for years, many years, first as the publisher of New Connection and then New Consciousness Review. And I've seen the many different ways that people have of waking up to what we're calling the new consciousness, and also the many different forms of new consciousness. I mean, I think that term covers everything from, you know, starting to be more conscious in how you eat, how you shop, how you consume, how you interact with people. Maybe another word for it is kindness and a sense of connection. Now, I noticed that some people had really, really dramatic experiences that kind of catapulted them onto this path. For other people, it might have been a gift since birth, excuse me, or it might have been a gradual process of learning, of exposure, of just feeling that there's more to life than what they tell me, and then just going out and learning about it for yourself.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that people will hear something like this without really looking more into it and think, oh, there's another one of those stories, you know, it's consciousness or doing things with consciousness, and they really don't explore the possibilities that, well, this might happen to you.
Very true. And you know, no man is an island. We are just so connected. And what we forget to focus on are the consequences of every single choice we make. And we forget that where we are today is simply the logical extension of all of the choices that we've made in the past. So, you know, it's really a question of feeling a sense of empowerment and knowing that you can make the choice that is best for you. You don't have to listen to all the experts because no one in the world will be as expert in your life as you are.
Many times on the program, that's exactly what I say, especially when it comes to health and healing. I always say you can go to a doctor. They can always tell you what they believe is the best course of action to improve your health, but ultimately you have to live with the decision that you make. They don't.
Absolutely.
Now, when you went to put this book together, how did you approach the specific people that you feature here in the book?
Well, I've been doing my radio show for many years, and most of them I had interviewed, so I kind of knew their backstory. And I thought that the story itself would be interesting, but I also had another criterion. I wanted to choose people who came from many different walks of life, who no one would think was a flake, a woo-woo, you know, a sandal-wearing, yogurt-eating, futon-sitting, far-out New Ager. These people are everything from doctors, professors, CEOs of multinational corporations, deep sea divers, military officers, you name it, we've got it. And these are people, very, very credible people, who have had the courage to say, there is more. I discovered that life was different, reality was different than what I had been brought up to believe.
Now, did you actually interview these people individually, specifically letting them know this was the direction you were going to take the information that you were gathering?
Absolutely. I asked them all the same 3 questions because I wanted to compare, their answers to the same questions. I asked them if they had had an experience. I already knew the answer. If they had had an experience that changed their view of the nature of reality, what was it? 2, what were the insights that they got as a result of this experience, and how did that change their life? And then 3, what is their message to the reader? And it was just so fascinating to compare all of these very different answers to the same 3 questions.
And that's what I wanted to encourage our listeners, is that you won't see a long-winded version of a tale here from someone, is that these average, they're about 2 to 2.5 pages per person usually, and that as you read these experiences, and of course the rounding up with the insight that they gained from the experience they had, is you'll have an opportunity to kind of sit and marinate with that. And I think that what the reader will find is there are a lot of very common things that really resonate in all of us. That sense of wonderment of, why are we here? Am I really using the special gifts that I was brought to this planet during this lifetime to use? Does my life really have meaning, so to speak? And each and every one of these people certainly discovered that, didn't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, why don't we go ahead and start with a story here of someone that you really found touched you personally. I'm sure they all did in one way or the other, but something that you thought, wow, I just didn't expect that.
Okay, I will go for, oh my gosh, there's so many fantastic stories, but I'm going to start with Paul Von Ward. Paul Von Ward was born in a sharecropper's shack in Florida, and he grew up very, very God-fearing, and he became a minister, but somehow there was a kind of a dissonance between the message that only people who come through his particular church will be saved and everybody else is damned. And so he went to university, studied psychology, sociology, lots of things, ended up in the Navy. He left the ministry, went into the Navy, and was just about, this was Vietnam era, was just about to be given a command of a PT boat when he just didn't feel comfortable with the military mindset, and he was able to transfer to the Foreign Service. So he spent the vast majority of his working life as a top-level diplomat, and then both around the world and then in the State Department. And all along, he kept on learning and asking awkward questions. In fact, when he was in the State Department, he asked too many awkward questions about how the State Department was run and actually put them in the book, so he was kindly invited to leave the State Department.
We don't want our secrets exposed about how the money is spent and giving us justificational reasons of why we actually do whatever it is we do.
But, this is a man with a prodigious intellect who simply was always asking questions, and his questions took him to a world view that we are not alone in this universe, that we are part of a vast panoply of intelligence, that these intelligent entities have visited this planet. Now, I don't know what he might have known kind of from behind closed doors in the State Department. He's not saying, but he has written books about we are not alone. So I just love how it was just a rational process that brought him to this view of connection in the among all of us to this universal consciousness. All one word, yeah.
You know, as I was reading through the book, it was interesting to note, just like you, that I've also had the same experience of being able to interview some of these people and talk with them one-on-one as well. And I know Gregg Braden, he is one that definitely stands out. And a lot of people will be familiar with him, you know, as the author of the book, The God Code, The Divine Matrix, which was the book that I interviewed him on. Fractal Time, Deep Truth, and on and on. So they'll take a look at someone like him and say, well, he seems to be one who's a quantum theorist. And I say, no, he's actually much more than that. And you actually cover that very well in the book with the specific question that he has: what can I give to the world that's emerging? What can I share? What can I contribute to the new world that's emerging? And so often when you take a look at a lot of people, you can see and sense and feel the frustration, especially in their eyes, of going out day to day trying to chase that dream, that somehow that elusive message is being fed to us. This is what you really want. This is who you really are. If you can't seem to get there, then there's something off or wrong with you. And I think there's a deep-seated frustration, yet at the same time there is a consciousness transformation, as you see so eloquently throughout this book, that people are saying, I don't know who's given us this message, but it's been wrong the whole time, because it places us in a position to come into this world saying, what's in it for me? What can I get? It's sort of as though I think we lauded the original robber barons of North America and the United States and the founding of America to say, that's what we should have done. and that's just all wrong.
Well, you know, I think that this sense of injustice and the sense that we have to giving back more to the world is, first of all, is growing everywhere. I think that's part of things like, you know, the Arab Spring, the sit-ins on Wall Street, the Occupy movement, and also it's a common theme amongst practically every single person in my book. It's this sense that I am put here for a purpose, and the purpose is larger than myself, and there is an element of giving back to humanity. And it's funny you should mention Gregg, because I just interviewed him last week about his latest book, The Turning Point. And what he's talking about there is how important it is to be awake and aware of what is truly happening in the world and what is coming at us, and to build in this sense of resilience for the challenges ahead, whether they're climactic or economic. And the way that we do it is through this mind shift into realizing how our actions impact the ecosphere, how they impact society, and being really, really conscious of building community and finding new ways to be in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that one of the authors, or people, excuse me, that you featured, but she certainly authored a profound book, is Diane Collins. I came to know her in one of the most interesting ways, and this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I happened to be at the library, and I was looking along a new book catalog or something. I can't even remember what it was. And at that time, I was really having some difficulty. And I looked and I said, what is this? Do you quantum think? And I thought, you know, thoughts that will really rock your world. I thought, well, that's an interesting enough title. So I began to pursue that, and I talked with the producer, and I said, you know, I'm kind of interested in taking a look at this book here and perhaps having her on the program. And so it was pursued, and it was almost immediate. With the following week, you know, I've talked with her. She sounds interested. There's a book on the way. As I began to read her book, Do You Quantum Think, I said, you know, this is going to be very enjoyable. I've interviewed a lot of people who have written books about quantum theory and call it even quantum thinking, if you will. And they tend to spew out at least the first 3 to 5 chapters talking about the history of quantum physics before they actually get to any kind of an idea of what the book is supposed to be about. She had to be the most original writer when I was reading what she wrote in her book, Do You Quantum Think, that I had read. I was like, this is fascinating stuff. I mean, it really felt like these were all her ideas. And she says, as we talked about this whole thing, about how we came together, she says, it's really interesting because that was actually an old catalog or something like that. I had actually been done with my tour and promoting the book and so forth. And she says it was just really interesting that you had called because I was interested in doing some things on my own. And was really excited because she says, and this isn't a pat on my own back, you were one of the first, if not only radio hosts who actually understood what the book was about. And I said, well, you can't imagine it came at that point where I thought, if you really apply what you're writing here, you'll realize, as you were just describing, and Gregg Braden talks quite a bit about many of these people in your book, Cher, is we are not alone, but we're tremendously interconnected, and life doesn't have to be as hard as a lot of us believe that it has to.
It's interesting how many people find Diane's story particularly relevant to their thinking. And what is fascinating about Diane's story is how she actually, how the penny dropped with her. She was on a diving off a boat in the Caribbean or something. She got a real cut on her hand as she came back up, and one of the, and it was bleeding like anything, and one of the women on the boat came over to her, wrapped a towel around her, took her into a meditation, and, did her healing thing, and when she opened up the towel, the cut was closed, and the woman said to her, you talk a good game, but you do not believe. And this is one of the hardest things for people on the spiritual path who have had, experiences, who know intellectually or who think intellectually that, yes, we have contact with angels and guides and other dimensions and so on. But we're always looking for proof. We're always looking to pull that down into the very matrix of ourselves until we believe it viscerally. And that was a big lesson for Diane, trusting. This is one of the biggest challenges I think we all have.
And there is a very good point for our listeners to really, stew on well after this show is when you talk about really knowing versus understanding. And there got to a point because a lot of times when people pursue, I think, the spiritual path or they try for the conscious awakening, I think a lot of times there's a sense of disappointment when they feel they've put some work into it, some time into it. And they realize, well, I'm still having bad days. I thought this was all supposed to turn into some sort of a bliss. And I wonder why that specific message or thought is out there in the first place that makes you feel that you're just going to be sitting on a mattress in some clean pajamas with a smile and your hands outstretched and everything just being laid onto you. But the fact is, the more and deeper your spiritual practice becomes, the faster your wishes become fulfilled. But then the question is, what are those wishes? And are you able to handle them?
Good point. And every time you kind of lapse back into doubt and into fear, guess what you're manifesting?
Exactly. And that's the funny thing about manifestation. And some of these people, as I've said, I've had the opportunity to have here on the Beyond 50 radio program, they talk about that. They say, well, what did you wish for here? Well, I wished for abundance, okay. But did you pay attention to your thinking along the lines as you were going after that? Well, no, not really. Well, okay, tell me about this bad thing that happened into your life. Well, I happened to lose my job and therefore, had a real rough time paying my mortgage or my rent or keeping up on my bills. Okay, well, let's explore the thinking behind your job itself. What did you really think about your job? What did you really think about the people that you worked with? How long did you feel and think this way? And they begin to realize that that loss of a job truly was 100% their fault. See, and then you remove yourself from victimhood, then you start to understand that spiritual path. And I know someone like you have certainly experienced something like this.
Well, going along that example, sometimes when you look back on it and you've lost a job and it's forced you to actually take stock of what you really want to do, and then you find that you either do your own thing or you find a different position that makes you so much better off. Sometimes the universe has ways of working on your behalf in spite of yourself. And that's another point behind my book. So often we get these little messages, little love notes from the universe, taps on the shoulder, sometimes 2x4s to the head. And if they don't fit into our understanding of reality, you might have had a precognition, you might have had a dream, you might have had a visitation. You don't have a context to place that in, and so you kind of file it away under do not disturb because I don't know what this means. Or if I tell anybody, they will think I am crazy, so I better not say anything. And my hope is that this book will give you somehow the permission to tune into these gifts that you have, the God-given gift of intuition. That is your internal GPS. Use it. Sometimes, how many times have you done something and kicked yourself afterwards because something was telling you not to go that way, and you went that way anyway, and you are paying the price? Listen to your intuition. That is why you got it.
Now, here's the thing. From your experience and from talking with these people, I'm sure you've had nice conversations. You didn't just ask these 3 questions and that was done with it. You probably really sat with them for a bit, didn't you?
Well, it's interesting. I interviewed them all by phone, and then I edited the interviews afterwards down to, the sort of essence of it. And some interviews took 15 or 20 minutes. Somebody like Bernie Siegel, we were still chatting 2 hours later.
He's like that. But you can't stop listening to him either.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, I believe he was the one I attributed the particular quote that I found fascinating, and it could be someone else, but I told him I believe it was you that said this, and it was on a tape series about love. And when I heard this, I thought, if people could hear this and really embrace it, they would realize that who they are is just a wonderful thing. But anyway, the quote goes, as he says, that after billions of years of evolution, just think about that, billions of years of it, no one can screw up quite like you can.
Well, and his message from this book is, how are we going to save the planet? By recognizing that we're all one family and there's nothing to fight about.
Just yesterday I was talking with a Russian physicist, and this is a gentleman who happened to harness what is known as subtle energy. Now, this is something that mainstream science hasn't been able to prove or measure, but now it's measurable. And he's talking about, and they're doing research on how they can use subtle energy, for instance, and how they can work in areas such as agriculture, pet health, our own health, on and on and on. And it was really interesting to talk with this gentleman because of the fact that something came up where I began to bring together a conversation that I've seen on PBS in which the host was bringing together a panel of 3 people in the communications industry. It could be a comedian, it could be somebody who's a filmmaker, and somebody else who is a journalist, for instance. And the panel discussion was on free speech, and where do we really draw the line of what free speech is? What are the boundaries of it, so to speak? And as we were talking yesterday, I started thinking about the war on terror. And I started wondering, after listening to this panel discussion and as I was talking with our guest yesterday, I wonder if the war on terror really isn't just a bunch of words that have been created to make us believe there's an enemy out there that really doesn't exist, because you think of the subtle energy of words and how powerful they are. And he kind of scratched his head, I think, a little bit, and he says, that's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, you don't know to what extent we're actually creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Well, on the subject of free speech, one of the areas where there's almost the least free speech is science. Mm-hmm. Because scientists who come out with results that are not within the accepted norm tend to be ostracized, or they have their funding cut. I remember I interviewed a couple of years back a chap named Michael Cremo, who wrote a book called Forbidden Archaeology. And he said that the basement of the British Museum is filled with miles of artifacts that will never see the light of day because they prove things that are outside of accepted norms, like that there was intelligent life 50, 100,000 years ago, that there was advanced technology, that there were giants 8 feet tall, and so on.
And I think the reason it's important for our listeners to know this is because it really resonated with the story that you shared in your book about Dr. Larry Dossey. Mm-hmm. Share that with our listeners.
Well, he was a medical doctor who, as a scientist, only believed in what he could measure and prod and poke. And he had a dream, a very disturbing and very vivid dream, about the child of a colleague of his. The next day, he was sitting in the hospital cafeteria with this colleague, and the mother of his wife with their child came in, and the child was red-faced, and his hair was plastered down from crying. And he had been going through some kind of medical test and protesting and fighting it exactly as Larry had seen in his dream. And it totally shook him up. And he told his colleague about it, and they both kind of shrugged their shoulders and went on to another topic. But then that happened twice more in that same week. And this got his attention. And as listeners may know, he kind of coined the term the non-local mind, the notion that consciousness exists somewhere outside of our little brain case, and we are able to tap into it, past and future, in a way that is not explained by normal theory. And this kind of set him on the whole trajectory of becoming the iconoclast and pioneer that he has become.
And it's really fascinating to know that, because when it comes to abundance, if people could understand that their ideas are unlimited, even though you apply an idea, it may not turn out the way you thought it would, just keep doing it because you have an unending stream of these things. And I think that when people come to understand that, it will really profoundly change them, and they'll begin to actually implement more and more. And I think we've gotten to a point, and I know in your book it resonates certainly true through a lot of these people. Where did we get to a point in our lives where we surrendered our intuition, where we no longer could believe that what our inner voice was telling us was true, that we could count on it? When did we get to a point where we had to reach outside of ourselves to the so-called experts and the people that somehow know something we don't, so we'll ask them for advice when we can't really seem to believe and trust in our own? And it's fascinating that once you can let go, once you can understand that you have everything you will ever need inside of you to solve any challenge, to have anything that you'll ever want or need, that will profoundly change you, that when you can actually learn to surrender, as Alan Hunter did, that you will realize there really isn't anything that you need to do but take action and move forward with your own life.
You know, you're talking about Alan Hunter and really some of the common themes across these stories. Mm-hmm. Trust is a big one. Service is a big one. But another big one is that we all have the ability to connect directly to Source. And to respond to your question, I think it was the early churches of all denominations that kind of pulled that power of connection to divinity under the canopy of the hierarchy, so that they could control, you know, the notion of salvation and the world to come. If everybody knew that they will never die, that they just go on and persist on an even greater form beyond this lifetime, then the hold of damnation and salvation is released from them. They know that they have direct connection to Source. And the way to develop that intuition is simply, or that connection, is simply to go into the silence. Whether you do that through meditation, whether you do that through being in nature and just being quiet, turning off the world around you for 5, 10 minutes, a half an hour, just being silent, that gives the space for the messages of love and beauty of the universe to come.
You bring up something that reminds me of a guest I had earlier this week on addiction recovery. And it's called Radical, I'm trying to remember what it was, Radical Recovery, I believe it was.
Oh, Kelly Turner?
Yes, I believe that was the name. And
Radical Remission?
See, the more you'll do that, the more I'll probably not even remember, but it was really more of the message, but thanks for trying anyway. But it was about a relook at the 12-step program. Oh. And he says, you know, and this is going to what you were just talking about the original church and how, okay, there's God. Well, since I'm the bishop or the pope or whatever the case may be, I'm the one that has the direct connection, and the only way you're going to get to that source is you got to get through me, and I'll decide whether you've done all the things that you need to do before I open the door and let you talk to this person. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is something, you know, really for our listeners to think about. So, now, with this guest that I was talking with earlier this week, the 12-step program was developed through Alcoholics Anonymous, and everybody knows Bill W. is one of the people that initiated this. He says, this day and age, the way the 12-step program is practiced, it's kind of off of what the original 12-step program was. And he says, one of the things that is missing consistently that he has found in the 12-step program is, one of the steps is meditation. They just don't do that anymore. And I said, you know, it's interesting because they've taken this on to be a religious philosophy in such a way that it's no different than what the churches were doing in medieval times, even up to almost present day. And that is, I am the messenger, I've been through this, I have the direct connection to lead you to what this promises, but until you do all these things and I give you that blessing, you won't get there. Now, here's something that I found concerning even after talking with yesterday's guest is this. Now that we're having this conscious awakening, we're starting to look at the churches in question and say, is this evangelist really on par? And we see a lot of hypocrisy in the church. And so we decide maybe we're going to go and figure all these things out for ourselves, which is what we should be doing anyway. As you suggest, go become quiet, become still, listen. You know, meditate if that's one way that you get there. People are beginning to question the church and beginning to explore these things on their own. They're building their spiritual strength, if you will. But the concern is, now that that's beginning to happen, it seems that we are now changing that golden calf, and it's now science that has replaced what the church has been doing. And you talked about that a little bit in the beginning of the program.
Well, I actually see that we are moving toward a convergence of science and spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly the message of the people like Peter Russell and, of Gregg Braden. Their thing is actually bridging science and spirituality. Einstein was kind of pushing at that border. The common theme, again, another common theme, book amongst the people who were of a more scientific bent, is that there is no contradiction between the two. That the information, that the source of energy, what some people call the 0-point field or the Akashic field, is not only the source of information and consciousness, but it's also the matter out of which we make creation. And the source, the ultimate source, again, consensus is love. So if we're talking about leaving religion aside and finding our own connection to spirituality, once you have that experience, that awakening experience, you are just so overwhelmed by the love, the inexpressible love that you feel, that you can not turn against your fellow man, that you yourself are permanently changed by this sense of love and connection. And I think that one of the greatest urges in the human breast is to reconnect with the mystery, reconnect with the source that you left behind. When you hear stories of people who have had near-death experiences, they've gone through the tunnel, they're on the other side, and they feel this absolute bliss, they don't want to come back. Some of them come back kicking and screaming. Others come back because they have this sense that they want to come back and be a testament to the fact that life goes on. People like Anita Morjani,
mm-hmm.
right? She came back from a coma in stage 4 cancer. And she came back because she felt it was her duty to tell people that they need to love themselves. The most incredible power to create, to affect their own physiology, to create good things in the world.
You describe, Miriam, also very well when it comes to the description of love, that of Gaetano Vivo.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to read that, because when you consider how you can apply that, it's easy for us, to be able to love someone who hasn't rocked our boat. But it certainly is a difficult thing to like somebody who has certainly perhaps betrayed us or wronged us. And I'm remembered of a story of Sister Teresa, where she was taking a couple on a nice little tour, kind of showing her what it was, or showing these people what it was she does. She takes care of people who are suffering beyond their own capacity at times to be able to take care of themselves. It's a very rough thing for a person to see firsthand. And there were times as they were going through the village that they would come across children begging for food or begging for money, who happened to be missing limbs, just really catastrophic-looking things, to where the couple wanted to reach into their pocket and actually give to them, right? And she says, no, don't do that. In many cases, what happens is they become disfigured purposely just so that you'll have that compassion to do this. So it's sort of a con, is what Sister Teresa was suggesting. Then all at once, as they're inside of this sort of shrine, if you will, this couple that looked like they were upper middle class came, interrupted what they were doing, grabbed a hold of Sister Teresa, passed the camera on to the couple that was with her, and insisted that they take a picture of the three of them together. Once that was finished, of course, the couple was enraged that there was that discourtesy to happen in the first place. And she says, Sister Teresa says, those are the people you need to love the most. Mm-hmm. What a profound message that is.
Mm-hmm. I interviewed Neil Donald Walsh a couple of weeks ago on his latest book, which is delightful. It's called God's Message to the World, You've Got Me All Wrong. And he's talking about the spiritual traditions that have this internal contradiction where they talk about a God of love, but you have to fear this God of love, right? So why should you have to fear him if he's a God of love? And so he's talking about the so-called end of prophecy that all the religions talk about, because, not everybody can go out and connect with God. And he says, that's where you've got me wrong. Everybody can connect with God. So you ask him, well, how do you explain, if everybody can connect, good people, bad people, how do you explain evil in the world? And he said that at some level, everybody is motivated out of love. Everybody is motivated because they are trying to avoid an emotion or a feeling that is more painful than the one that they are acting out on. And when you kind of take it back to original source, like in the case of story with Sister Teresa, people maiming children so that they can beg for them in the streets and arouse compassion. We have to look at perhaps a broader perspective, a society that is so unequal that children are starving and parents are willing to give their children to these people who, even though they maim them, at least the children are begging enough for something to eat. This is why it's just so important to realize the necessity to have a broader perspective, necessity to be empathetic and open your eyes and your heart to the connection among us all, and work for a world where that wouldn't be necessary.
And I think that people, if they consistently did this at a point they feel a little downtrodden, should watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Right.
There's the epitome of someone who's considered evil, and I liked how Ron Howard reimagined that story to kind of show you the backstory of what the Grinch was when he was little.
Yeah.
But the point being is you take all that away and you think that if I take these things away as the evil guy, but yet that love still exists, wow, I think I've kind of missed the mark here, but maybe I can participate in that too. Mm-hmm. Miriam, tell us your story.
Oh, my goodness.
What moved you in this direction of conscious awakening? Because I also know that you were formerly involved with New Connections magazine located in Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, about 18 years ago, my husband and I were living in England, and a good friend of ours, unfortunately, killed himself. And then, shortly thereafter, started coming to my husband in his dreams, and then started coming to my husband when he was awake, and kind of blew him open psychically and see things about people, precognition. And he had one friend, acquaintance, who he saw at a crossroads between the cemetery and the hospital. And he just had an understanding that he needed to contact him and tell him to go see a doctor right away. And he did a sufficiently good job in scaring the pants off him that he went the next day, and he found 3 coronary arteries completely blocked and 1 partially blocked. and he probably would have been dead in days. And as it was, he was able to be operated on and has been dining out on the story ever since. So this got our attention, and both of us were left-brained corporate types, and we started reading everything we could about psychic phenomena, and it just started us down the rabbit hole. One of the first books I had read was one of the Lee Carroll Cryon books, in fact, the first book in the series. I had introduced these books to a friend of mine who was living in Portland, and he said, well, Cryon's going to be speaking here. So we came to Portland to visit, and we met this most amazing group of awake and aware individuals and healers, and we said, okay, this is where we need to be. So we sold up, and we came to Portland. That is history.
And you have to ask, at least for our listeners anyway, when you see or experience somebody who's awake, if you will, what does that look like? Because I think sometimes people have trouble or they try to wrap themselves around what is a picture of that because of the images we tend to see of what we think that is.
Again, it's so individual.
Mm-hmm.
And people will be awake in some areas of their lives and still have blockages in others. And, we were all a work in progress. And it's only a question of how far along our path we are. And, I kind of see us as all being like on the spokes of an enormous wheel of fate, kind of moving in towards this center of consciousness. And we're all on different spokes and different paths, and it doesn't really matter. One of the gals in the book, Irene Kendig, had a lovely phrase. She said, there is no wrong way to do life. You just have to trust that. And you do the best you can at any given time. And we are, in fact, trying to do the best we can. With what we know. The more we know, the more options open to us. The more power we have, the more internal juice, creative juice we have to manifest things that are not only good for us in the short term, but good for us in the long term and good for the collective.
I knew somehow you would light up. Miriam, it's certainly been a real pleasure to have you here on the program. Again, the book is What Wags the World? It's Tales of Consciousness Awakening. Is there a website people can find out more about you and your work?
Absolutely. I really invite people to go to my main website of New Consciousness Review, which is ncreview.com. We have a new magazine that we launched that is free online. Just subscribe, and it's got some fantastic interviews and, of course, book reviews and articles, and we'd love for you to subscribe. And if you have had any experiences that you want to tell me about, just use the contact form. I would love to hear from you.
Remember, you don't have to be famous to be profound for that person out there, because your story may be the one that lifts someone else out of the darkness and into the light. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. Again, the book is What Wags the World? It's Tales of Conscious Awakening. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.